The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. It's good to mention to people to check out our third episode, the one on Serena Williams, where we get into, some of the hurdles that female athletes, particularly female athletes of color, have to deal with when it comes to being treated differently than their male counterparts, or being treated differently than their white female counterparts. I think that definitely applies here, because in that episode we even covered how not only Serena but also Naomi Osaka has been treated quite unfairly by the media and by fans. And I don't think it's always even across the board in terms of how fans treat specific athletes or how the media treats specific athletes.
Yeah, well, her introduction to the tennis world was beating her big moment. One of her big first moments was beating Serena,
right?
And she was booed.
She was booed.
She
we
was
talked
booed
about
for
that,
it,
yes.
right? She got heavily booed, and that must have been an unbelievably. Again, can't speculate, and maybe she was fine, but burying her head in her hands would indicate that she felt pretty shitty about that. Yeah. And that's not a. That's a tough way to be entered into that whole world. So
and she's not. a lot of these athletes are not incredibly old, right? They're mostly young.
Yeah.
I know we've said this before, I think in different episodes, but if I had to deal with the social media stuff that young people, even non-athletes, have to deal with these days, when I was young, forget about it. I would have made some catastrophic mistakes. And then you factor in the pressure and the attention and the spotlight that these young athletes have to deal with. It's a different animal. I think people that haven't done it before struggle to actually empathize and understand what that's like from on a consistent basis, to always have the microphone in your face. And I think this also, to me, there's a parallel here, because she mentioned, I think her and a lot of athletes have mentioned, I think the topic here that started to kind of come to the surface is basically how do sports, any sports in general, have to change the overlap between the sport and the athlete and the media? And one of the ways that surfaces that topic is some people suggest that interviews should not happen right after the game. And that relates to what we talk about with parents, right? One of the things we talk to parents about a lot is don't rehash every element of the game.
Timing.
Yeah, timing is so key, right? Timing and the nature of your delivery and the nature of the specific kid or athlete in terms of how they receive coaching. Those things all matter very much. Timing matters. So if a parent goes and harps on their kid 5 minutes after the game's over, the kid's going to be harder on themselves than anybody else.
Right.
They're probably not going to receive that. This is sort of similar, where it's you're asking an athlete, whether, especially when they lost, but also when they won, they pick them apart. That's what the media's job is right after the match or the game. Is that really beneficial to everyone? I don't know. What do you think?
No, I don't. I think one of the biggest things that I've sort of seen, and especially in this process here too, and I haven't heard too many athletes talk about it this way, but it's just been something I've been really curious about. The media sees athletes as products, right? They don't really see them as an individual person. They see them as something that's going to make me money. I'm going to write an article about this interview or these questions or whatever it happens to be, and I'm going to get clicks and I'm going to get compensation for that, right? They're not seen as a human person that they're looking at. And I think that's a big issue with the sort of how media is structured. And when you constantly, if you're an athlete and you're constantly in a seat answering questions, and most of the time media knows what sells and what doesn't, they're not looking for, good news about the person. They're usually looking to break them down and tear them apart. Because that sells. And if you're being subjected to that constantly, of someone trying to get something from you for their own benefit, that's incredibly validating and dehumanizing. And you can see why a lot of athletes have big major issues about having to do those press conferences, especially after a loss. The last thing that you want to do as an athlete is to go and talk to somebody about how terrible you feel, right? And I can remember from one of my experiences back in college, the 4x4 relay in my freshman year, we were ranked really high and we didn't perform the way that we should have. And right after, I like sat in solitude for probably like 10 minutes. I cannot imagine having to go sit in front of a bunch of microphones talking to people where I'm definitely not present for that conversation. I'm off in my own head, beating myself up, tearing myself apart, all that different stuff.
Yeah.
The last thing that I want to do is try to talk to somebody who clearly has no real thought and really does not care about how I'm doing. Right. They're really just trying to extract information so that they can serve their own purpose. And that's a real issue that needs to be talked about. And I don't necessarily know if there's a solution to it other than just not having media coverage for like post game or interviews. And it's not just with athletes too. Like you see it with coaches, like mid game interviews that they have to do like during the games. I can imagine not a single coach in any league wants to be talking to an interviewer about something. They'd rather be spending that time talking to their team about what they need to do or how they need to change or all those different things. It's just, it's this weird balance of athletics and money. Because the media is there to help make money, and athletes are there to perform, have fun, and do well. And those are sort of in contradiction to one another, and it's a real challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes it's like you can tell there's some members of the media who ask those questions like really intent. You can just tell they're trying to like dig and get under a person's skin and get them to react because it's sensationalism sells. Yep. And then other times, I mean, we'll get to Kyrie in the second part of this episode about fan behavior and stuff like that. But at other times, I don't think anyone asked him about stepping on the logo. And so like there are times when like there's a clear cut like softball question and no one asks it. So like I see both sides where it's like sometimes you have these reporters that dig intentionally to get the sensational thing that's going to sell, clickbait headlines, that kind of thing. And you have other times where it's like the question that needs to be asked. I think it's like the responsible journalistic approach to ask it isn't asked. So I see a little bit of both on that. I'm going to play devil's advocate on this one because I agree with you that it's not a good thing. It's certainly not good for the player. And yet the reason why these people make all this money with these sports is because of the media and because they have TV deals, they have sponsorship deals. Because of the expectations of the TV networks and the sponsors, they expect these interviews to happen. And they have decided that if they don't happen, it hurts their bottom line in terms of what they're paying for. So it's all part of that marketing business machine. And without that, it doesn't run the same way. Now, I don't know, for someone who's not, these companies and these TV networks are obviously biased towards themselves. Whether they're accurate or not in terms of how much they would lose out financially if they didn't have interviews, I have no idea. I can't imagine it being that much. I think maybe there's just people are averse to change a little bit, and this is the way they've always done it. Yeah. Because I actually think there's a way to be creative and do things differently that might actually make it more entertaining and less harsh on the athletes. And yet I also understand, like, from a business perspective, they're spending a ton of money, TV networks for these deals and sponsorships. The companies that sponsor, they might have expectations like, no, like we don't want an interview the next day. No one's going to care about that. And the news cycle is way less than 24 hours. So there's some merit to that, I think. That if you do an athlete interview about a game that happened on Tuesday, but you do it on Wednesday, I don't know. People are going to be focused on what's happening Wednesday. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it just plays into the sensationalism that you talked about. Like the media wants to try to capture that emotion in an effort to sort of be like, well, we're showing the athlete. I just don't know if there's it doesn't seem like it's a balanced piece. If an athlete's saying like, hey, I really just don't want to have this interview, I'm not in a space to do this, I'll talk when I'm feeling a little bit better, there's a harsh punishment for that, right? Like I think most athletes are fined if they're not if they don't participate in media or things like that. And I just don't see that as a benefit. I also, again, I'm speaking out of my world. I don't work in the world of marketing. So I'd be really curious if an athlete doesn't do an interview, how much money they're actually losing. I don't know. Right? Yeah. I can't imagine they're losing millions and millions of dollars on that. And especially if an athlete's like, look, I don't feel comfortable doing this, and then being fined to do that, and then coming back and saying like, yeah, I'm losing, like we're hemorrhaging money now because of that. I have a hard time believing that.
It's hard to know because it's like, I can see them saying, look, the raw interview stuff sells because it goes more viral on social media, and that virality, or whatever the word is, leads to more sales of sponsorships and things like that because the numbers are up.
Sure.
Is that worth it? For I don't know, because like if you zoom out, like I don't know. I mean, I think you'd rather have players in a good place, and I do think like if you look at, I don't want to bring up like Barstool as some shining beacon necessarily, but like if you look at the way they get creative and use humor to me, it's like you don't have to, totally copy that. But like having something where you bring in like, instead of just doing the typical, like, let's try to piss off this athlete after a loss as much as possible, if you could get creative and bring some humor or something else into the post-game process, I feel like that would even be a little bit better. I don't know. I think there's a lot of different ways people could go, leagues could go, and athletes could negotiate to do these types of things a little bit differently. Maybe have other athletes ask questions. I mean, like, there's different things you could do. I think that would help. I do think it needs a bit of an overhaul. I think the overlap is kind of, it doesn't work anymore. I think in the player empowerment era and in the social media player as a platform kind of era, I just don't think it matches up anymore. And they have more control and power. And you can shift more toward the media overlap with sports needs to reflect where things actually are a little bit more. And I don't think the post game, that type of style format really does anymore.
No,
right?
Athletes don't need the media anymore to have their voices heard. They don't need
especially in the NBA. I would say I don't know about tennis, but
right. They don't need it anymore. They have all these athletes have their own platforms now to be able to say what they want to say and when they want to say. Yeah. So one thing that's interesting too, and of course, like, I'm a little bit more biased, but if I was sort of in a marketing standpoint, and I wanted to have the best product, right? Because I do think that they see these athletes, especially the ones that they sponsor, they see them as products to make them money, and they want them to be performing the best to make them the most money. If that included allowing for them to pull back from media coverage in order to be a better product or performer, so that their performance is going to go up, they're going to be feeling better, they're going to be doing better from a marketing standpoint, I would actually want that, right? So being able to pull back from the things that are clearly deterring and taking away from the athlete being able to perform the way they want to or at their best ability, if that's holding them back and causing, I know with Naomi, she's talked about like depression and anxiety, trying to play a tennis match with that stuff going on. I can't imagine that would be very easy to do. And from a media standpoint, I would want to see the best product on the tennis court. And if that included removing the barriers that are going to get in the way, I'm obviously biased because I'm geared way towards mental health and marketing and things like that, but that seems to be a better solution of how can we help these people feel that they are confident going out with what they're doing without any of these hindrances or barriers to hold them back, and how can I as a manager or marketing person help to do that? I feel like that would be a far better approach to trying to get the most out of people. And again, it sort of serves both purposes. It helps the athlete feel like they're in control of their own life and not having to be, predicated at all these different things and do all this different stuff they don't want to do. And they would perform better, which would increase their product, like be a better product and help those firms out. So I guess I'm kind of thinking out loud here too, but something like you said, something needs to shift because it's not the same. It doesn't reflect what it needs. Players did need to have media to get their voices heard before social media. So this is a good point. This is all different things now.
Yeah, I want to touch on that because I think one thing as you were talking that it made me think of is like there's a massive difference now. Not just we've talked about how the player empowerment, player as platform kind of thing has shifted stuff, but also if you look at like, I would guess in generations past when social media wasn't so prevalent that if you if you get asked a couple negative post game questions, it's like, I can handle that. But in the social media era, I think there's two reasons why that's almost unfair. One is because the second you're asked those questions, it's broadcasted across social media and you are vilified. Like exponentially, right?
Yeah, right.
And then two, even outside those interviews, the amount of crap these players deal with people online. And like, yes, we could all sit here and say like, we'll just ignore it. We all know that's easier said than done. And they are responsible for, we're going to get to this, for learning how to do that, I think a little bit better, but way easier said than done. So they're already dealing with that type of negativity and toxicity online, on social media all day long. Now you have this like the media generating these like viral softball kind of negative, paint them in a bad light questions.
Right.
I mean, we're almost just asking them for too much here, I think, to the detriment of the athlete. And I think that's what you're talking about, where it's just, it's not going to benefit anybody in the end.
No.
One thing I want to talk about real quick before we get to Kyrie is that athletes do sort of, until it shifts, right? Hopefully, maybe we just shift it so that this isn't needed. But until then, I think athletes need coaching on mental health, emotional management, media interaction. And I kind of think who stands out to me is like Popovich, Brady, Belichick, guys like that, people like that who, I'm sure there's others who know how to handle the media. Like to me, it's about what are you trying to achieve. I think a lot of people, when you're just focused on being a human, you come into this type of media interview, and I think the expectation is like you'll get asked normal questions or that the people care about you. But we have to remove those expectations.
Right.
That, like you said, they have an agenda, right? And it's often taught to make you look good. And so if you look at the way Belichick, Brady, Popovich, they're kind of different, kind of similar. Popovich is the halftime question where he just like one-word answers.
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't get fined, but he's not saying anything either.
Right.
So he's like, you're going to make me do this stupid interview? Fine. Here you go. Yes, no, yes. Done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Technically, he followed the letter of the law.
He did
right?
what he was supposed to.
There's no reason someone like Naomi Osaka can't do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Because she wouldn't get fined. And I think that doesn't mean she has to do that. But I think people need to get coached on this to understand, like, what are you trying to achieve? You don't have to answer all those questions. And if you answer them with just the generic kindness, respect, 5 words, whatever, and get out of there as quick as possible. I know if I was coaching an athlete, that's what I would say, right? Be like, thank you for your question. I'll give that some more thought, but sure, yeah, I see where you're coming from. Just generic stuff that you're not saying yes or no to anything. You're just kind of being respectful, thanking them for their questions, and then kicking the can down the road. I mean, Brady does that to a T. Like, if you ever watched him do interviews, I haven't seen him as much recently, but when he's on the Patriots, obviously, he's just positive about everything. He doesn't really get into much. He sort of has non-answers for everything. And it's like an art form in terms of not exposing yourself to negativity, not really creating news cycles around your name, but filling your requirements and being kind to people. To me, that's the way to go. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think, I kind of think it's a balance. I think that we're athletes, and I think for the most part, they do have some sort of like public relations, like training for most teams. I think they have it. Even in college, they have them too. I think they definitely cover some of those things, but it's also like we're creating a solution to a problem that shouldn't exist, right? So like we're trying to help athletes manage something that shouldn't need to be managed in the first place. And so that's, it's 2 separate issues that, yes, I think we still need to continue to coach athletes on how to manage these things because it is still the reality that they have to go with. With Naomi, I think it's a little bit different because, yes, could she have gone to the interview and been like, yes, no, and been sort of like stoic and shut off and cold? Certainly. But I think from what I've read about what she had said and what she did say was that even like going to that interview was going to be really, really difficult. Yeah. And even that experience of being subjected to most likely people asking about her mental health and asking about all these different really personal questions that she didn't really want to get into. Yeah. I see that as like she shouldn't have to be subjected to that. And I get that her requirements like are to, right? Right, exactly. Well, yeah, we can get into that in a sec. But what I was going to say was that, if she should have the choice, she should have the choice without the fear of penalty of getting fined this money for being able to have a choice of like, you know what, I'm not in a space where I can be subjected to this because, to your point, I think for the most part, most of the stuff that gets asked is pretty negatively focused and geared towards that. And then once it's out in the general sphere, it gets manipulated and destroyed and dragged through the mud. And I think that's most people's experience.
But they sign these deals though. Like these athletes sign that they're going to do these media interviews, and they collectively bargain in sports like baseball, basketball. The players' unions collectively bargain these details. So, if you're playing devil's advocate on the other side, they could say, "Well, why don't you negotiate to do things differently? Why didn't you negotiate when we were all at the table together? You signed. You guys agreed to this. Yep. This is your responsibility." I can see where they're coming from too.
Yeah. I see both. I definitely see both sides for sure. And I think that could be something like, again, in terms of like the bigger picture, that could be something that they could talk about how to mitigate that moving forward. Because I get it. But I don't agree with it. Right. So I think that's sort of like the more meta, I guess, conversation of like how to fix that interaction. And then the micro is like how to support the athletes who, like you said, have signed these contracts, are expected to do these types of things. So how do you support them like in the moment of like, how do you get through these interviews that we have to do, or just suffer the consequence of the fine and do it that way. This
is where my question to you is like, and I don't know how this works. I'm not sure if you do, but like if a player got injured in a match and they couldn't walk, would they be expected to do interviews? I don't think so. I don't think they'd be fined either. I think it'd be like they need medical attention, whatever. This is where like the mental health. If a person's in a rough enough place with depression and anxiety, that is no different in my opinion. Yeah. And like if they're not in a place to be able to talk out of fear that it's going to harm them, just like walking up to a podium if your like leg is broken or whatever. Yep. I don't know. I feel like they should be given the same leeway.
I agree. Yeah, you don't see a lot of like hockey players who've gotten a concussion, had to go to the hospital, have to come up and do their post game interview. Like, hey, walk me through that your head getting rung up right against the boards, right? Yes. Of course, it is. It's definitely a double standard. It's a good point that they should be seen sort of on equal playing fields, but they're definitely not.
They're not, and that's where I think like maybe you don't even have to collectively bargain it because it's like it's considered health, right? And if it's health related, now I know this is where like I think the sports world just doesn't trust the mental health side yet enough, and they're gonna call like they're just gonna assume the person's lying or that kind of thing.
Yeah,
and I think that's where it's like you just have to trust the person in terms of what they're saying. And are some people gonna lie about it? Maybe, but I think the masses are not gonna make shit up. They're just gonna say like, look, I can't go, I can't do it right now, that kind of thing.
Yep.
So I want to kick it to Kyrie. I mean, we don't have too much time, but we'll kind of cover this quickly. If you haven't checked it out yet, we did an episode on Kyrie and communication, which is seeming prophetic at this point, given what's taken place. I think it's our 11th episode, but you can just search for the Grim Drive podcast and look for Kyrie Irving and communication. This kind of comes on the heel of that because we talked about his tendencies when it comes to communication. He is kind of an enigma, and he has, a lot of his teammates say he's a great teammate. He's had other teammates clearly say different things. I think as a fan, it was very frustrating to have him on a team in this. Even when things were going well, I was not a huge fan of Kyrie as a person. I felt like he threw teammates under the bus pretty regularly. I felt like he gaslights the media and just makes problems for himself and for other people. And this kind of relates because recently, he brought up the city of Boston, right, as he hopes they keep it to basketball. Basically saying, like, in my opinion, gaslighting the racism topic, just throwing that out there to be chewed up. And spit out multiple times to take attention off of himself, right? And in my opinion, that's what he was doing. It wasn't about because he said in the past. Now I don't know. He said in the past that he's never been subjected to racism in Boston. Now that could have happened since, so I don't know if he says he has now. I haven't heard that, but I'll believe him.
Yep.
But so he throws that out there. And if it was about that, I'd say fine, like fair enough. And there's a lot of other athletes that have said that about Boston, so it wouldn't be out of the realm of what's realistic. But knowing Kyrie, that's not why he did it. He did it to take focus off of him coming back to the city that hates him now. And they hate him because of what he did, the lies and saying he'd stay and not, and then really sandbagging it in the playoffs and all the stuff the fans hate, And to me, it's kind of, I think it was validated by Jaylen Brown, who came out and said, like, I don't really agree. I'm paraphrasing here, but I don't agree with it being, this topic being thrown out there to take focus off of a playoff game, that kind of thing, right?
Right. Yeah.
And to me, that's like, I really agree with that. Now, I'm biased towards Jaylen Brown because I love him as a person and player. He's just a great guy. But to me, that's exactly what I was thinking when I first heard Kyrie say it. I was like, oh man, you're going to intentionally create this storm. To me, that's the opposite of what you want to do if you actually care about racism, right? And I think that's what Jaylen Brown was saying. Like, if you care about racism, don't bring it up in this context where that's just going to, hit the beehive. Like, do something constructive outside of a playoff game, that kind of, which I think Kyrie has done in other ways too. So to be fair, so there's that whole thing, right? Then he steps on the logo after the game, and whether that's connected or not, some guy throws a water bottle, which was maybe partially filled at him. And I think those all things happen in the same game. Are they the same topic? No. I think, to me, I don't think, for those who say these topics need to be discussed separately, I mean, give me a break. Like, I think everyone who watched that game knows that these aren't compared. It's not like you're comparing someone stepping on a piece of wood with a fake made-up logo to someone throwing an object at somebody. Yeah. But they happened close together in the same night, in the same context. So obviously,
people talk about it together. Yeah.
They're going to be linked in some way. It doesn't mean that they're considered the same. I think this is one of those like Twitter things where people just go nuts and they're like, oh, how dare you? And give me a break. We can use our common sense here.
Yeah.
So I want to kick it to you a little bit. What do you think about, you can start wherever you want with the Kyrie thing in terms of what's happened recently.
Oh man, that's a big question. I think for him, based on his previous behaviors, and again, we can't speculate. We're not in his mind. We don't talk to him. We have really no idea. But based on his previous examples, the comments he made before the playoff game do fit a pattern for him of how can I make this not about me, and
then blame other
people, right?
Media, fans,
right. It's always been the media. It's been the players. It's been the people around me, and it's very rarely been about him. So, and again, I think he's a tough conversation because I see him through multiple lenses, right? As a fan of Boston, I hate the guy, right? Hate him. And
fan hate,
right?
It's
not real hate, fan hate. Because he can drop 40 points against you in the playoffs and destroy your hopes of making it past that round. So, or stepping on the logo like a fan thing. You're like, oh yeah, you get all fired up about it, right? But from then, And from a clinician standpoint, he does a lot of stuff for his own mental health, like taking time away and things like that,
and
like
meditating,
and he does a lot of things to promote like positive behaviors for athletes within that sphere. So it's hard. You have to sort of like compartmentalize.
Okay, can I stop you for a second? Because you're totally hitting a point that makes this so confusing to me. Because he's almost like, I just wish someone else besides Kyrie has started to become like the beacon of mental health days. He's like the worst person for that to be, in my opinion. Because I actually think it's going to work to the detriment of that being accepted widely.
Yeah.
Because of how he's manipulative and he does things in a way that are like, I actually think it's going to make the league and owners like less likely to allow this for other people because they just, if he's the spokesperson for it, I think it takes away credibility for it because of how untrustworthy he is in different ways. But I don't know. I think that's what you're touching on.
Yeah, and so it's hard because I do have to like purposely remind myself. I'm like, okay, how am I thinking about him right now?
Yeah.
As an advocate for mental health, great. He talks about it. He took time away to get himself squared away. I respect that. I really don't appreciate some of his behaviors, right? I really don't appreciate like you said, the gaslight in the media or constantly trying to make it about anyone else besides himself or taking much accountability for anything. Or when he does take accountability, it's sort of like the I'm sorry you felt that way type of vibe. It's not like taking full accountability.
When he created the whole thing.
So it's hard to buy into that for him of like, well, doesn't really still sit with me well. Yeah. And I think there's a reason for that. And I think that it happens consistently. Yeah. He's pretty consistent with making the same type of pattern mistakes.
He's a manipulator for sure.
Like the sage thing in Boston, like sprinkling sage. I do this with everywhere. No, you don't.
Yeah, it's me being me.
It's me being me.
And
you don't do this.
There's plausible deniability there. And this is like, it's classic manipulation what he does. And this is why, like, not even as a fan, beyond that, as a clinician, as a person, he concerns me with some of this stuff because I think we know in our work, like you see some of the subtle things he does and how he does it in a way that allows him to cover his tracks. To me, it's very nerve-wracking in terms of how manipulative and skilled with manipulation it is because he gives himself those outs. He gives himself plausible deniability. Like, what are you going to tell me? I can't just be myself. And there's nothing you can say to it. Right. And yet all your logic and your awareness is like, give me a break. Like you're spreading a sage smoke thing around the perimeter of a court when you know the camera's on you.
Right.
You know what you're doing, man. So, but then he'll tell you like, no, I'm just being me. And there's nothing you can say. Right. It makes you go nuts. That is gaslighting to me in a nutshell. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think again, it's easy for us to, speculate and sort of like drive ourselves mad about it without really knowing like what's going in. And maybe there's some truth to it, right? Maybe we can give him a shred of benefit of the doubt of like maybe he does sages all the courts and we just don't see it. I doubt that very much. Yeah. So I want to be careful to not like get too much into like speculating about him. But it's when it happens consistently and over and over and over again, it does remove that from it, right? Yes. It does remove that benefit of the doubt. If you're like, well, if you were constantly doing this, man, like there might be something to that.
Correct.
And it's infuriating to be both a fan, but just as a person to like see these types of things. And I do think, and he's even been spoken about this, of like he will mess with the media like on purpose. Like he'll do that on purpose because, and he's been pretty outspoken about the media in general and its, toxicity and terribleness about it. And he's been pretty outspoken about it. So it's hard to determine like, what's his purpose for doing? Is just to like mess with us to do things? Is he really trying to be sincere? I haven't quite seen sincerity from him yet.
Exactly.
So it's hard for me to get there. But I always have to like, when the topic of Kyrie's coming in, I have to like be purposeful about like, okay, how am I seeing him right now? Because like I said, it's in different phases. Yeah. It's either like I really don't like him as a fan. I can respect what he's trying to do for mental health, but I agree with you. I think that it's going to end up backfiring because owners are going to be like, come on, like we can't do this. Of like taking mental health days, they're just gonna be like, well, look, Kyrie,
without communicating too.
How Kyrie does it, right? Exactly.
He just took off and didn't tell anybody.
Right. He's just gonna peace out. Right. Yeah. It's gonna end up really backfiring.
It's a bad example for younger players, in my opinion.
I agree. And mental health in sports is already an uphill battle. It's already hard enough to get athletes to buy in. Why doing preventative work and doing work with a clinician is so important, especially as a professional athlete. To have that working against it is just, it's as a clinician, it's frustrating.
Yep, absolutely. And I think if you contrast that with like Dak Prescott, someone who, if he came out and said he was taking a mental health day, I mean, it's my personal opinion, but I would trust that 100%. I wouldn't think he has any other motives or that he's like disingenuous in any way. So I think that's where like I hope someone else in the NBA kind of slips into that role a little bit, because I think it would be better overall for the main goal. The main goal is that mental health is more accepted and players are allowed to take these days without any controversy. I don't know if Kyrie is the spokesperson, the leader for that's actually going to happen. So
yeah, and Kyrie, because I know you're listening, obviously, to our podcast here, I would really be interested in trying to figure out like what might be going on in like a place that he could come and talk and be non-judgmental. I invite you to come on the show. I know you're. Like I said, we should hear from you any minute now. But I would love to kind of get an understanding of it, because I think a lot of people would really benefit from hearing his authentic side of what's going on. I don't know if that'll end up happening, but it would be interesting to hear like a real response from him.
I agree. And so, at the end of the game, he is. He's the object is thrown at him, and we've seen in a short span, I think in the span of a week, we saw like multiple like popcorn dropped on somebody. I think dropped on Russell Westbrook. Mm-hmm. We saw that happen to Kyrie. I think that someone at the New York Knicks game, Knicks fans tried to spit at Trae Young on the. Did you catch that?
I did
on
see
the
that.
court side?
Yeah. So
there's a lot of things in the span of a week, and it brought up this conversation about fan behavior. And like the question I guess we should consider is like, is it getting worse? And if so, why? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I don't know if it's getting worse.
Yeah.
I feel like it's always been there. I feel like fan behavior, and to some extent, has been was worse beforehand. I think we're seeing it more.
I agree.
I think
completely.
it's more accessible. We've got cameras and mics, everything, and we're seeing more of it. And it's more of a narrative now. I think also because this has been one benefit for athletes having their own platform is that athletes are talking about it. So I think it's just been more. I don't think it's one of those situations where like, oh, all of a sudden it's a problem. I think it's been a problem, and now we're just really starting to fully understand how bad it's been for some of these players because they've been more outspoken about it.
I agree. I think there's some factors I noted down for this episode, like that I think contribute to it happening in general right now, like influencer culture, the pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. Fans maybe struggling with mental health and being irrational after the pandemic. Alcohol obviously is usually involved with the people that make these decisions. Maturity and the need to impress. You tend to see a lot of young guys doing these kinds of things, throwing objects. They're around their friends. They want to look funny. Yeah. That kind of immature crap that tends to happen with people under 25, guys under 25 especially. Entitlement. I definitely think that's the people that do this tend to be a little bit entitled. So those are all factors that play into this. And that being said, I don't think it's worse. I actually think it's less. It happens less than it used to. I think it, like you said, it's more cameras, attention, accountability equal more visibility, but I don't think it's actually happening more right now. I think it used to happen a lot less happen a lot more back in the day, and it just was captured less, and the reaction was less, right? I think with fewer cameras on it and with less of an uproar amongst the media, people didn't cover it as much, but it definitely happened much more back in the day. Even in Philly, I think there was some serious incidents where like hard objects like batteries or things like that were thrown. So and
I'm sure it's happened at the Garden too. It's absolutely happened. Definitely happened at the Garden as well. Yeah,
for sure. So I think that's where we're going to wrap it up for today on this episode of the Grim Draft podcast. We appreciate everyone tuning in for this one. This one was about interviews and fan behavior, and we covered Naomi Osaka and Kyrie Irving. We'll be back next week to talk about identity and profession.
Thanks.